So I want to talk about the actual show called Barbarians. And when I thought about it, I talked extensively about the Latin language and a few other historical aspects in reviews over on polýMATHY, but on this channel, in this video, I want to talk about the show as an actual television show. And as I mentioned in my most recent review over on polýMATHY, there is something really weird about how the Romans constantly refer to the Germans as barbarian. It's interesting that the Romans are given an especially racist kind of depiction. And this just doesn't work with an historical perspective. And this is probably because the writers are trying to add certain characteristics to the adversary here, the ancient Romans, that are influenced by more modern ideas. The ancient Romans would definitely look down on people if they had a primitive way of life or culture or something like that. But the very fact that Varus says, you were born a barbarian, so born a barbarian, always a barbarian, is the idea. And it's entirely fine for a few characters, ancient Romans, even hypothetically, to have that idea. The problem is that Varus is very much the mouthpiece of what ancient Rome is meant to represent. Varus is speaking for Rome. He is the anthropomorphization of the Roman state and the Roman expansion and conquest. And the writers want us to be absolutely certain that he is bad. The way he seems to take so much delight in cruelty, the way he looks down on the Germans as being a kind of inferior race. Not because of certain habits they might have, which certainly could be different if they grew up somewhere else, but because of their blood. And being the student of history that I am, of course I'm quite conscious of the horrible cruelties that were a part of not only the daily life of the ancient Romans, but certainly there are many wars of conquest, and there is no modern morality today that could look back on that and say that any of it was inherently good, and probably that most of it would fall well short of any kind of morality today. That said, the ancient Romans would assimilate other cultures, and it's not that they would make them Roman. The Romans would then kind of become like them very frequently. In the middle of the final episode, episode 6, there are spoilers by the way, Arminius has this long speech, which is punctuated by the events of the battle at Teutoburg Forest. And he says, some fight for what used to be, implying the Romans, or their adversaries, it would seem in this case. Others fight for what is to come, as if that's better. It's interesting, he places this dichotomy. And he goes on to say, some fight for love, or for love. And then, you have Arminius and Tusnelda together. Which, it just strikes me as so weird. But obviously, these are the protagonists, and I think there's some kind of conflict, perhaps, with the writers, or they just simply don't have a clear vision, or perhaps the contradiction here is just not presented in a way that is satisfying, because with this kind of a speech, it's almost breaking the fourth wall. The character is speaking to Varus, to his head, his severed head, but Arminius is essentially speaking to us. And he's conveying whatever this show is supposed to mean, whatever this first season is supposed to tell us, where the writers have given themselves the opportunity to tell us. And this is what it is. Some fight for what used to be, for some, I guess, some kind of fiction of the past that the Romans fight for. Others fight for what is to come, or for love, that being, of course, a universal good, right? And the fact that Tusnelda and Arminius were both involved in betraying their friend Folquin, it seems so strange that they should be this kind of ideal now. We fight for honor, for glory, for freedom. These are highly punctuated in the scene. And I think we're supposed to understand that this is a good thing, or at least the protagonist is certainly convinced that this is a good thing. When we see in this very moment Folkfin, he's able to take revenge specifically on that Roman soldier that was whipping him in the camp. The ancient Romans, if they have any speaking lines at all, are universally depicted as mustache-twirling bad guys. There is a place for that, but I don't think, looking back 2,000 years, is really the right time for it. And that's because we can't easily look at any historical figures and use our own morality to judge them in a way that's at all satisfying. Now, a program that did these kinds of things extremely well, that is to have satisfying character arcs, relatable personalities, but in the weirdness of this ancient world with all its cruelties, was the Rome series on HBO many years ago. Because in that series, there wasn't ever an attempt to really say to the audience that, oh, this character is inherently good and this one's inherently evil. It was more a series of Shakespearean tragedies, of events that were inevitable given the circumstances of the world. And the writers of the HBO Rome series were not trying to tell us, oh, you should judge these characters as the good guys and these as the bad guys. They were all pretty apparently bad in the decisions they made, and a lot of them had some moral struggles personally within the moral framework of their society, and sometimes those societies are a little bit different too. In that show, Julius Caesar, one of the protagonists, is excellently portrayed not as a pure hero and not as a pure villain, but we understand what he's doing and why, and that he's very intelligent, and eventually his deeds catch up with him when he's assassinated. And the people that assassinate him, we can see that they have a very good motive to do so. But the drama that comes out of it is particularly to see how eventually they are then outmaneuvered by Antony. Eventually Antony is outmaneuvered by Octavian. And at no point are we ever supposed to really admire one of these groups and disdain the other. But in the Barbarians show, it seems like we're really supposed to say that, yeah, okay, these barbarians are killing some Romans in a pretty gruesome way. But that's justified because of the other 6 episodes here, the other 5 episodes, plus what happens in the 6th episode. It's justified because of how awful the Romans are. They're so cruel and so wicked to these Germans, the so-called barbarians, that they have it coming to them, Varus in particular. And I find that really boring. Not because I prefer shows that have moral gray or something. Sometimes shows like that can be really great, like, say, Better Call Saul or Breaking Bad. They can be really interesting and fascinating. Or sometimes they can be done extremely poorly and be just utterly boring. And also, there are wonderful things, like, say, the original Star Wars trilogy, where there are clear good guys and clear bad guys, and that is excellent. So there's nothing wrong with it in principle. It just doesn't ring true, I think, for anyone who has a good sense of what these ancient peoples were like. Arminius goes on in his speech to say, your greatest weakness was your trust in me. That's interesting. What are we fighting for, he asks. Was it worth it? I like to think this isn't purely rhetorical, that he's really trying to have this introspection. We see a bit earlier, he actually vomits out of the agony of what he's about to do. I find that characterization very interesting, and I like to see that he's struggling, but ultimately he's come to a conclusion that seems to be completely convicted, specifically that you never understood that we might want a different life than you, to believe differently, to feel differently, to think differently from you. That's not what the show was telling us about this character. The show was telling us this character, Arminius, wanted to be Roman because he'd been raised Roman. Yeah, he had this past, but he wanted to be Roman. He expected his life to be in Rome. So when Varus shocks him by saying that you're going to become the new rake. And he's like, what? Well, this is what I raised you for. And I didn't tell you until just this moment. It's so weird. It's such a strange thing to do. Now, this relationship between Varus and Arminius is not at all historical. As far as we know, Arminius and his brother Flavus, they both became Roman soldiers and officers. And later in history, we'll hopefully get to see in the 2nd or 3rd season of this show, we'll get to see Flavus talking to Arminius across the river. One is on the Roman side, the other is on the German side, and hopefully that's done in a very interesting way because it's such a great piece of actual history. But they weren't raised so that they could go and become leaders of the German tribes again later. As far as I understand, in the actual history, Arminius ended up actually becoming the leader of so many Germans and German tribes because of this act of betrayal and because he led them to do it. Not because he was in charge of one of them, put in charge by Varus to be a leader of them and to be, a Roman implant and so forth. That didn't happen as far as I'm aware. I don't have a problem with it as an idea that the writers could have come up with. It's creative and it's interesting and it adds some layers of dichotomy. But the fact that Arminius goes from thinking he's going to be a Roman to then suddenly being made a leader of the dirt people, this is supposed to break his heart, but it just doesn't seem realistic. Naturally, they would have been telling him for a long, long time, for years, you got to get ready for this. And that could have been very interesting. It would be less dynamic within the show, but we'd have him go through with flashbacks like they did frequently in the show how he was getting used to this idea. You know, there could have been, I think, more realistic ways to portray Arminius getting used to the idea over many years. So the last lines of this speech have to be what the writers want us to take away from the show. You never understood that we might want a different life than you, to believe differently, to feel differently, to think differently from you. This sounds like a kind of call to independence from imperial conquest that could be pointed out from, say, St. Joan by George Bernard Shaw, and the historical figure in particular of Joan of Arc. We could see this in stuff that the United States has been involved with for the past 20 years, right? So I think that in particular, that very modern example is what the writers are trying to do. They're trying to make the ancient Romans be some kind of obvious modern style imperial bad guy trying to impose its will as a state onto other peoples who just want to live independently. You know, we fight for freedom, says Arminius. We fight for glory and for love. We are the good. Like, I couldn't possibly imagine the writers have made it any more clear to us than if they said, we are the good guys. Like, the writers are trying to say, hey, the barbarians are the real good guys and the Romans are the bad guys. I can't imagine it being any other way in what they want us to take away from this. And my problem is that just doesn't ring true with history or with the actions in the show, because we do see that a lot of these Barbarians do a number of things that are morally questionable for sure, even by ancient standards. As an aside, I think it's really funny that right here in the middle of the battle, there is the famous "ah!" The Wilhelm scream, which first appeared in the movie Distant Drums in 1951 and has been used again and again in cinema for 70 years now, and they should really just stop using this because it seems like they just can't find someone to record a screaming sound. But that's a small nitpick. I think the visuals are amazing in this show. And the sound, the costume design, all that is great. My problem is really, I don't really know what the writers are trying to tell us, because if it is this simplistic, I can't believe they would do that. But like I said, they did try to give depth to Arminius' character. They did try to show him to be torn about this decision. You know, he sees Varus as a father, and then he says, you know, I never doubted you, or no, you'll do me proud, my boy. And the way he says it in Latin, the translator did a great thing where he said, mi bone puer, which could be something like my good slave boy, instead of simply my good son, which is very interesting. I thought that was a good choice because that was definitely what the character is supposed to be. However, the Romans are they're just too two-dimensional for Arminius to be legitimately conflicted. If the Romans were demonstrated to be a little bit more rational in what they were doing, not just cruel, not just acquisitive, it would make Arminius' decision much more interesting, because ultimately he does make the choice to be for the Germans and not for the Romans. Unfortunately, though, they had the character of Varus go ahead and make him a rake. You know, they made him the leader of his tribe. So he was already on the German side. And as far as I recall, that's not how it was in history. He was still serving with the Roman military and then ended up betraying it at Teutoburg Forest. And I think the writers are doing that so we still feel like Arminius is the good guy. But there's a massive problem. And there are actually two, the contradictions to historical past and future from the perspective of the finale. So the past, it wouldn't make sense for Arminius to have been surprised. Why Arminius should have been surprised? No reasons given in the show. It makes much more sense if he really was supposed to be the rake the whole time for Varus to have told him and raised him like, look, you're going to go back and be the rake someday. He'd be like, oh, okay. He would be expecting to do it. There's no good reason not to tell him. And so we're supposed to feel like, he was tricked, and we identify with the main character. The main character was tricked by the bad guy. They're so bad, and he has to make a tough decision. It doesn't ring true to me. And then there is the most difficult part here, and I think, man, this show's going to have to really do some kind of impressive U-turn. And I really hope it's part of the plan that all this identifying we're supposed to do with Arminius, the notion that we're supposed to see the Romans as just these mustache-twirling bad guys, we the audience, we're supposed to have the interpretation. I hope that gets turned around, because what's going to happen, here's the spoiler alert, if you just, read the Wikipedia article about Arminius, you'd learn what happens next. So Germanicus, the general, he is sent by the emperor to lead these enormous campaigns of revenge. And they completely destroy the German armies. They decimate villages. We're talking about probably tens to hundreds of thousands of Germans, including women and children, horribly dead because of the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, because of Arminius. So Arminius, I can only see this show really saving itself narratively. That in the successive seasons, in the second, third season, however many seasons this show gets, if it shows that what Arminius did, whatever moral good reasons he might have had at the time to betray Varus and the Romans, it ultimately ends in, Tusnelda gets captured and driven in front of a Roman triumph. So he's going to lose everything. He's going to be the leader for a while, but eventually he's going to get assassinated. His wife's going to be enslaved and killed. And so much horrible pain and death and suffering is going to come because of his original betrayal. Now that is a Shakespearean tragedy. That is very interesting. And that is an inevitable part of this story. So when we get there, we'll know if the writers were trying to change what they did in the first season, or if this was their master plan to show us at the end of season 1, for people who don't really know the history, look how good Arminius is, and then totally subvert all of that in a future season by showing how Arminius is filled with remorse, and then maybe have a similar speech to this, where he correctly reflects on this with a lot of regret, a lot of remorse, and says, maybe I shouldn't have done that original thing, or I had no idea my action would have led to so much unbelievable suffering. That would be really well done on part of the writers. However, I don't think they're going to do that because of just how clear they are trying to tell us that Arminius is somewhat conflicted and he's not a perfect human being, but ultimately he's the good guy and his actions are righteous. And what he's saying here is correct, that we fight for love, we fight for freedom, and we didn't want to be dominated and changed by you Romans. Again, that just rings so hollow because that's not what the Romans would do. They'd say, hey, you just got to worship this Roman pantheon, keep all your old traditions and language and all that. You got to learn Latin if you want to do anything in the government or probably in any kind of finances. But other than that, you get to be how you were. If for some reason the writers want to show us a fictionalized ancient Rome that doesn't do that in this situation or is making all kinds of other sinister plans, okay. And maybe that just didn't work its way into history, okay. But it has to be justified through how the Roman state actually worked at the time and what its actual behaviors were, rather than the ancient Romans being evil for evil's sake, which is all I'm really getting out of the first season. If the writers at the end of the last season of the show, whenever it will be, I imagine that ending will be the death of Arminius. If he instead is reflecting to the audience through some kind of a speech like at the end of the first season, and he says, I did the right thing, and this was the right thing to do because it kept the Romans from conquering this territory ultimately, I don't know. I don't think that would be the right move. My interpretation is that the writers have a very clear idea about stuff that is going on or has gone on in the international sphere, And I make no judgments here about that opinion. I think all those things are worth debating and talking about, but making the Romans into something similar like that is probably mistaken because it just doesn't ring true historically. So those are some of the issues I have with this. Would I recommend this show? So I would recommend it to those who like costume dramas, especially if you like ancient Roman stuff. This is one of the most beautiful looking, accurate depictions of ancient Rome when it comes to visuals, and also the fact that we have so much spoken Latin. The spoken Latin has a number of flaws, but it is far and away the best and most extensive use of spoken Latin with authentic historical pronunciation, as close as the actors were able to do in cinema so far. The sets are lovely, beautiful scenery, the cinematography, the coloring just absolutely gorgeous, and there's some pretty good acting all around. But narratively, the show leaves a lot to be desired, since the adversaries are painted just too cartoonish to be really interesting, to me at least, despite the great acting, especially on the part of Varus, who he has to do the heavy lifting. He has to basically play the entire Roman Empire. I think he executes what the writers intend very well. I just don't think that it's a very interesting depiction of the ancient Roman opinion or is very interesting for a television show. I do think a future season can redeem all of this if it has Arminius demonstrate some deep regret after the coming massacres, which will be the blood on his hands. He's going to get so many Germans killed, the very Germans he supposedly was protecting due to his betrayal of the Romans at Teutoburg Forest. The way it's written so far, I'm not convinced that's the directions the writers will go, but we'll see. I will be watching Season 2. Will you? And what did you think of Season 1? Thanks so much for watching, commenting, and subscribing.